Good evening. We've all heard the phrase, they'll miss you when you're gone. But have we ever asked, when exactly does that happen, not just in passing, I mean truly, neurologically, emotionally, psychologically? When do people start missing you for real? Let's begin with the brain. When someone is consistently present in your life, your brain gets used to that presence. The interactions, the conversations, the validation, all of it becomes part of a predictable pattern, and the brain is wired to adapt to patterns. The key chemical at play here is dopamine, which many people think of as a pleasure chemical, but in reality, dopamine is more accurately described as the motivation or anticipation molecule. It's what drives you to seek out things you associate with reward, not the thing itself, but the chase, the tension between not having and almost having. So here's the paradox. When you're always around, always available, always responding, the brain doesn't release much dopamine in connection to you. You've become part of the expected baseline. There's no gap, no distance, no craving. Just consistency. And while consistency is valuable for trust and safety, it's not what drives longing. Now, take that same presence and remove it suddenly. What happens? That removal creates what neuroscientists refer to as a disruption in the reward prediction error. In simple terms, the brain was expecting the reward, your message, your voice, your attention, and suddenly, it's not there. That's where the dopamine system kicks back in. It starts firing, not because it received something, but because it's not receiving something it was used to getting. That's the gap, the dopamine gap. This is where missing begins, not because they stopped caring, but because your absence finally gave the brain a reason to pay attention again. Without that absence, there's no opportunity for the neural circuits tied to desire and anticipation to activate. It's the silence that reminds them, not the noise, and ironically, the very act of stepping back, of becoming unavailable, is what reintroduces emotional significance in their mind. The brain begins to search. It starts to crave, and in that craving, a space opens where connection used to live. That space, that's where they start missing you. The human brain doesn't remember everything. It remembers what matters. And what matters most, neurologically, is change contrast. Emotional memories are not stored with the same intensity across all experiences. They become stronger when the brain perceives a shift, a disruption, or a sharp emotional peak. When someone is consistently present in your life, their presence becomes part of your environment, almost like background noise, familiar, safe, reassuring, but not always vivid, not always emotionally intense. That changes the moment they're no longer there. Suddenly, their absence creates a sharp contrast, and that contrast is what the brain registers. Where there was once warmth, there's cold. Where there was attention, there's silence. Where there was shared meaning, there's now space. This contrast creates something called emotional imprinting. The brain encodes the memory of the person not just based on who they were, but on how different life feels without them. It's in that contrast that before and after that longing begins to take form, and the more intense the emotional highs were when you were present, the sharper the drop feels when you're gone. This isn't a conscious process. It's embedded deep in the limbic system, the emotional machinery of the brain. Specifically, the amygdala works to flag emotionally significant events, while the hippocampus binds them to specific memories. So when someone feels a sudden drop in connection, even if it's subtle, the brain flags it as important. The result is a lingering emotional signature, a residue. They may not immediately know why they're thinking about you, or why your name resurfaces in their mind during random moments. But the contrast between your presence and your absence has already been filed away, waiting to be triggered. The stronger the contrast, the deeper the imprint. That's when they start missing you. Not just because you were there, but because now you're not, and the emotional system is trying to reconcile the shift. The missing isn't just about you. It's about the space your energy once filled, and how loudly that space echoes once it's empty. The experience of truly missing someone doesn't usually happen in the immediate aftermath of their absence. In fact, the brain is remarkably good at short-term compensation. When someone is removed from your life, whether by choice, circumstance, or distance, the nervous system doesn't panic right away. It fills the gap with distractions, routines, noise. The conscious mind convinces itself that everything is fine, while the deeper emotional circuits simply go quiet for a while. But the brain is always adapting. This process is known as neuroplasticity, the capacity for the brain to rewire itself based on new experiences and the absence of familiar ones. When a person disappears from your daily life, the networks that once lit up around their presence begin to reorganize. And this reorganization isn't instant. It tends to follow a rhythm. Around 21 to 60 days after the initial separation, people often begin to experience the psychological weight of what has changed. This is the point where the emotional consequences begin to set in. The brain realizes this isn't temporary. This person might not be coming back in the same way. The old pattern, the voice you used to hear, the energy that used to show up in your space, isn't being reinforced anymore. And that loss becomes real, not just intellectually, but neurologically. The emotional circuits begin to resist. There's tension between what the brain wants to restore and what it knows it can't. During this adaptation period, the person may start to remember moments not as events, but as feelings. A glance, a laugh, a moment of safety. These aren't just memories, they're emotional landmarks. And as the brain tries to rewrite its internal map without you in it, those landmarks start to stand out even more. That's when they really start missing you. Not just because of what you did or what you said, but because their nervous system had started to build a version of reality that included you. Now it has to rewire that reality without you, and that's not a neutral process. It's felt as discomfort, as longing, and sometimes as grief. Missing someone, then, is not immediate. It's a delayed emotional response that shows up after the brain has done its best to pretend it's fine and finally realizes it's not. Missing someone rarely happens in isolation. It's almost never a quiet, deliberate thought like "I miss them now." More often, it's sparked, triggered, by something seemingly unrelated, a song playing through a store's speakers. The way someone laughs across the room, the familiar smell of a certain cologne, or the taste of something you once shared. These aren't just coincidences. They are sensory cues that reactivate the emotional memory of a person's presence. This process is deeply rooted in the way memory is encoded in the brain. When we form a connection with someone, especially one tied to strong emotions, the brain creates multisensory associations. The hippocampus, which stores memory, and the amygdala, which processes emotion, work together to bind feelings to physical sensations. What you were hearing, seeing, smelling, or doing during emotionally charged moments. These associations remain dormant until something in your environment reactivates them. When that happens, the experience is immediate and physical. It doesn't feel like recalling a memory. It feels like being pulled back into a moment. The brain can't tell the difference between a real event and a vividly remembered one. So when a familiar cue hits the system, it brings that person back into focus, not just cognitively, but emotionally. Their absence suddenly becomes present again, and it hits with a kind of emotional velocity that can catch a person off guard. This is why someone might not miss you when they're busy, distracted, or in new environments. But when they return to a space where you once existed, when their senses are met with something tied to you, your absence re-enters their nervous system, and it doesn't always happen in moments of sadness. It can strike in laughter, in comfort, or even during a casual drive home. That's how emotional memory works. It's non-linear and often involuntary. So missing you doesn't begin with a decision. It begins when a piece of their world reminds them of how it felt when you were in it. That reminder bypasses logic and goes straight to the body, where memory is stored in sensation, not just thought. In that moment, they don't just remember you, they feel you, and in that feeling, they realize something's missing. One of the most powerful drivers of human behavior, both neurologically and psychologically, is the principle of scarcity. The brain is wired to assign more value to things that are less available, not because they're necessarily better, but because they trigger an instinctive response. I might lose this. I can't easily get it back. This mechanism evolved to help us prioritize survival-related resources, but it operates just as strongly in relationships. When you're constantly available to someone, always responding, always present, always giving, your presence becomes predictable. And while predictability fosters trust, it also leads to perceptual normalization. The brain starts to treat your presence as the default. It stops evaluating your impact. It stops measuring your value in a conscious way because you're simply there, part of the environment. But the moment you step back, something shifts. The brain registers that change as a disruption to homeostasis. It begins to reassess your role. Without realizing it, the other person starts to revisit your qualities, not because you're saying or doing anything, but precisely because you're not. They begin to focus on what's now missing from their psychological landscape: your energy, your support, your insight, your voice. And the prefrontal cortex begins calculating the emotional cost of that absence. This process isn't deliberate. It's not a punishment or a game. It's a natural cognitive recalibration. Your perceived value increases because the brain is wired to pay more attention to what it doesn't have easy access to. Scarcity creates focus, and focus leads to heightened emotional importance. It's the same reason luxury items or limited time opportunities feel more compelling. They're framed in scarcity. You, in your absence, begin to occupy a similar space. It's in this absence that people begin to realize not just that you mattered, but how much. The things they overlooked when you were near suddenly stand out in sharp relief. The little moments, the insights you shared, the reliability you offered, all of it starts to rise in emotional weight. That's when they start missing you, not because something new happened, but because something they thought was always going to be there no longer is, and the brain, when faced with that kind of loss, doesn't move on quickly. It pauses, it revalues, and in many cases it regrets. So often, the most honest recognition of your worth doesn't show up in your presence, but in your silence, in the gap, in the scarcity. That's when they feel it. And that's when they finally start to see you clearly. Human beings don't just form relationships with others. We form relationships with the versions of ourselves that exist in those dynamics. Every meaningful connection becomes a mirror, reflecting back a certain identity. You are a different version of yourself with your closest friend, your partner, your mentor. You laugh differently. You speak with different energy. You access emotions and thoughts that may not surface elsewhere. In a very real way, who you are is co-authored by the people you interact with. So when someone you've been close to is no longer present, their absence doesn't just create emotional distance. It creates identity disruption. The brain isn't just registering the loss of another person. It's registering the disappearance of a part of you that only existed when they were around. And this is critical to understand. The emotional weight of missing someone is not always about them. It's often about the version of yourself that is no longer being reflected back to you. This experience of disruption is deeply rooted in the brain's narrative systems. The default mode network, a system active during rest and self-reflection, is responsible for maintaining your inner story, your sense of self over time. When someone plays a significant role in that story, they become integrated into your internal structure. You make plans with them in mind, you build habits around them, you attach meaning to shared rituals. Over time, they become part of your psychological continuity, then they're gone, and now the narrative has a hole. The story doesn't make as much sense, routines feel off, places feel strange, the future you imagine even in small, everyday ways, suddenly lacks context. This is why grief, longing, and even nostalgia can feel so overwhelming. The absence isn't just about losing a person. It's about losing a reference point for who you were when they were with you. The brain begins to resist that disruption. It replays memories not just for comfort, but in an unconscious attempt to maintain identity stability. Who was I when we were together? What did that version of me feel like? The longing often isn't for the past, it's for the version of the self that existed in that emotional space. And so, they start missing you when they realize that something inside them went quiet when you left. That a certain light dimmed, that a part of themselves became harder to access. They might not be able to articulate it, but they'll feel it in the way they move through their day, in how certain moments feel less full, in how they suddenly don't feel quite like themselves. That's when it hits, not just that you're gone, but that the version of them that existed with you is gone too, and the nervous system begins to mourn not only the connection, but the self it helped bring alive. So when do they start missing you for real? It's not when you walk away. It's not when the texts stop or the calls fade. It's not even when they say they miss you. It's when the brain catches up to what the heart has already started to feel, when the dopamine no longer gets its fix, when familiar cues start to echo, when scarcity rewires perception, and when their own sense of self begins to falter in your absence. It's a quiet process, a biological one, an emotional one, a narrative one, and it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments, unpredictable, powerful, often inconvenient. It sneaks in through memories, through silence, through identity dissonance. It shows up not as a grand realization, but as a persistent feeling. Something is missing, and that something was you. Real missing is not sentimental, it's structural. It's not just emotional pain, it's a system-wide recalibration of value, memory, identity, and need. And it only becomes possible when you step back far enough for them to truly feel your absence. Not as a punishment, but as a mirror. Not as a game, but as a necessary space where recognition can actually grow. So if you're wondering when they'll start missing you, the answer is this. They'll start when the silence becomes louder than your words ever were. They'll start when your absence finally gives meaning to your presence. And they'll start when their nervous system, their memory, and their own inner story realize you weren't just a part of their life, you were part of their wiring, and that kind of missing, that doesn't fade easily. It lingers, it teaches, and if they're paying attention, it changes them.